right, welcome to another episode of the Regenerative Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Max Gulhane, and today I have the absolute pleasure with sitting down with Lily Nichols. Lily is a registered dietitian and an absolute expert on prenatal, preconception, nutrition, and she's read a book, perhaps the Bible of prenatal nutrition, which is called Real Food for Pregnancy. So Lily, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with this, I guess the background for why you read the book and the beginning of your chapter, one of the chapters you've wrote, you've explained to people why they should have a real food pregnancy. And to me, that almost feels like stating such an obvious thing, but it's something that I feel is so necessary in today's environment, which is awash with refined foods and all kinds of processed foods. So maybe give us a bit of a background about yourself and why you wrote your book.
Yeah, sure thing. Yes, some things that seem non-controversial that I write are highly controversial in my field, right? So it's always a challenge writing to like a broad audience when everybody's coming in with their own perspectives, which is why I try to level set by coming back to, hey, these are what the official guidelines tell us we're supposed to eat in pregnancy, or the nutrient targets we're supposed to hit. And this is like a sample meal plan showing what makes up such a diet. And then people are like, what? Oh my gosh, I had no idea that was what they were recommending. So I try to kind of level set to get people to understand, who maybe aren't in the nutrition field or in the perinatal field, just what we're up against, because the guidelines are pretty outdated. Anyways, that's an aside. But as to why I ultimately ended up writing this book, this is my second book. My first book was Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And I kind of have to talk about that book to lead into why this other one came to fruition. But my career as a dietitian has been heavily in the prenatal space, and in a lot of different areas. I've worked at the public policy level with the state of California's diabetes and pregnancy program. So actually seeing what goes into the writing of guidelines and the amending of guidelines, which is an unbelievable amount of red tape to making changes to that, by the way, especially if what you're suggesting conflicts with sister agencies, right? So from that angle, from the training of professionals, from private practice, from working in a perinatal office under OBGYNs, consulting on research studies and protocols. I mean, it's run kind of the whole gamut. So I've been able to see through many different lenses, which I think is important, because sometimes you'll sit down to listen to a presentation from a researcher and they're so siloed in their research world that they have no idea that the protocol for their study is full of so many holes. They're missing the point because they're so focused on this one little tiny thing. Likewise, you have clinicians that are so busy and so burnt out that they cannot keep up with reading research. I'm in a really unique position that I have created this sort of career for myself where I could read research and teach about research all day, but I also have the clinical experience to kind of put it into context and really critically examine the studies to see if their protocols and methods even made sense, and what areas they may have been missing. And really, it was in my client work that I saw just how great the gaps were in what was in our policies versus what actually worked, particularly for gestational diabetes and these women's blood sugar levels. Because if I recommended the conventional diet, which as a good rule following dietitian I did at the beginning of my career, their blood sugar levels got way worse, or at the very least they didn't improve. And that was really disheartening. And that's kind of what set me off on this path of wait a minute, I need to rewind and see where and why these guidelines are set, where they're at, what's the evidence that was used to set them, what is the newer data that has come out since, what's the normal physiology of pregnancy, what are we expecting to happen, what are we trying to support, what data is out there. And that really became a springboard for examining everything else. So like the gestational
Mm.
diabetes book is its own thing. After that came out, everybody was asking me for a resource on prenatal nutrition, just in general, not specific to blood sugar issues. And arguably, you can eat the way in the gestational diabetes book and be fine. However, there's a lot more guidelines that need examination as to whether they're really justified or not. And that's really what I do in Real Food for Pregnancy. I'm looking at all the macronutrients, the micronutrients, the most nutrient dense foods. Do you really have to avoid all these foods? The guidelines on exercise, just going through all of that and laying out the evidence so you have kind of a clear path as to what makes sense, what doesn't. Why is maybe one clinician telling you one thing, but my book is telling you another? Like, just, information. So you get to make up your mind and decide how you're going to proceed with your pregnancy.
Mm. And I think it's a reflection of the greater kind of confusion or lack of rigor that's inherent in the field of nutritional epidemiology, which for most people is, I guess, the evidence base or the science that is underlying why we're eating what we're eating. And anyone who's been following guidelines and eating guidelines for the past 20, 30, 40 years, it's basically you're being yo-yoed between all kinds of restrictions and don't eat eggs, don't eat red meat, don't eat saturated fat, eat all these whole grains. And frankly, it's been incredibly harmful to people, and it's
Yeah.
been almost schizophrenic in its inconsistency. So you can imagine when you're applying that to something like pregnancy. I mean, you've historically women have got a lot of mixed messaging. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously the work you've done is so important to help clarify and provide guidance to people. I'm interested in gestational diabetes, and I guess the reason why you started your author journey is the same, I guess, underlying problem, which is women who are having problems with their blood sugar in pregnancy are overwhelmingly being told still to adopt a higher carb type diet, and one that, as you said, just inevitably plays havoc with their blood sugar, and not uncommonly
Yeah.
results them being put on insulin later down the pregnancy. So, tell us a little bit about how your approach helped women, I guess, get their blood sugar under control and avoid some of those consequences.
Yeah. Well, it's a long story, right? The guidelines are what they are. They're pretty high in carbohydrates, and overwhelmingly in the dietetics field. There's this assumption that there's a mandatory minimum requirement for carbohydrates in pregnancy of about 175 grams per day. Some are actually arguing for much higher than that now, which is another story. But when you break that down over meals and snacks, just from let's take it down to toddler logic level, you break down that into individual meals, and then you compare the amount of carbs in those meals to the amount of carbohydrates or glucose in the glucose tolerance test, which is usually used to diagnose gestational diabetes, also known as carbohydrate intolerance of pregnancy. And it makes no sense that if a woman fails a 50, 75, or 100 gram glucose tolerance test, now we're going to be telling them to eat usually no less than about 45, 50, 60, 75, or so grams of carbohydrates at every meal, and then expect them to have normal blood sugar, right? So there's just a disconnect on basic logic with the guidelines as a whole. There's a whole chapter in Real Food for Gestational Diabetes breaking down sort of the origins of that 175 grams, why there's a lot of faulty logic applied to that as well, and just inconsistencies within the guidelines themselves on defending that level. But nonetheless, very first and foremost, once I understood the physiology of what's going on with pregnancy, blood sugar metabolism, insulin, ketones, and had enough reassurance that it was actually safe to go lower than 175 grams per day, which it is. That was obviously one of the first changes that I made, is that I stopped requiring my clients to eat a mandatory minimum level of carbohydrates. Like if your blood sugar is coming out high after a meal, that means your body is not able to tolerate that level of carbohydrates in one sitting. We need to reduce it. And obviously you can't just reduce carbohydrates and then like not increase other things. So by default, you have to increase the foods that are other sources of non-carbohydrate calories, namely fat and protein. And we had really excellent results blood sugar wise with that. And like, I mean, the whole pregnancy as well, our rates of, percent of clients requiring insulin or medication for blood sugar management dropped by at least half. Rates of complications at delivery, like shoulder dystocia, babies being born macrosomic or, larger than expected, that precipitously dropped as well. So overwhelmingly, it was positive. I ran micronutrient analyses to make sure that my meal plans were still meeting, the basic nutrient requirements for all your vitamins and minerals and all that. And oftentimes they're more nutrient dense actually than the alternative conventional diet that's so high carb. So yeah, it's a matter of like, we really need an individualized approach, in my opinion. So like you get the client a blood sugar monitor, glucometer, you have them test their blood sugar just with their normal eating habits and see what's going on. And then you make adjustments from there. It really doesn't have to be rocket science, but I feel like a lot of people in my field make it seem like it's so, complicated and so crucial that you do this and you count this and you count that. And a lot of times it's really not that hard. There are some, trickier sticking points. Managing fasting blood sugar, for example, is a little bit trickier, but it can be done as well. So yeah, that's the basis of it. You got to see what's going on with blood sugar levels, titrate carbohydrates where they need to be, keep caloric intake sufficient, meet your micronutrient needs, and you're good to go.
Yeah. Well, I just gave a talk last weekend on the history of animal fats and seed oils particularly, and what really stands out is that prior to dietary guidelines that started in the late 70s, that started recommending a low saturated fat, low animal fat diet, and replacing these with polyunsaturated oils and carbohydrates. Prior to that time, people were basing a lot of their energy on animal fat and animal meat and those types of foods. And it's fascinating and obvious that once you remove those from the diet and you're insisting that people use carbohydrates as the chief source of energy, that you're necessarily going to be losing a whole range of fat soluble vitamins that come with those animal derived foods. And obviously you've got a new source of energy, which is carbs, but you're losing so many micronutrients, and you're losing what I believe and what the evidence evolutionarily shows was our evolved source of energy, which is animal fat. So
Yes.
it's fascinating that, and I guess not too surprising that this type of approach that we've, I guess, been insisting women follow has come with problems, and then going back to
Yeah.
the traditional approach of more animal fat and animal protein, which you have to consume as a corollary of eating more animal based foods. People get better. So I want you to talk a little bit about, I guess, a large premise of Real Food for Pregnancy, which is a preconception feeding period. And I've interviewed Jenna Poole on my podcast, who's a nutritionist here in Albury, and she has a great concept of a micronutrient power bank. And basically, it's an idea that prior to becoming pregnant, we want to, just like a power bank, we want to make sure that that's fully charged before we go through the process or before becoming pregnant. So, Lily, can you talk a little bit about I guess that concept as you describe it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. Thinking of it like a power bank or a battery pack is a good idea. Sometimes I'll use like a bank account analogy. The period of pregnancy, if with the bank account analogy, is a time of withdrawal. And that time of withdrawal continues all the way through postpartum, and particularly for the duration of breastfeeding as well. You're never going to finish a pregnancy and have higher nutrient stores than you started pregnancy with, even if you're eating optimally and supplementing well and all of that. It is by default a significant drain on your nutrient reserves when you're growing a brand new human being from scratch. Even more than that, our preconception nutrition also influences our egg quality as women, and for men, sperm quality as well. And if you go back to the whole cycle of, egg development prior to ovulation, when it's actually like ready to be fertilized, and also sperm development, you're looking at a couple months for each. Sperm development a little bit shorter than the time frame for egg development, but nonetheless, like, takes two to tango, and both partners' nutrient reserves and metabolic health do play a major role in egg and sperm quality, and thus the chances of conceiving within a reasonable time frame, and then having all this delicate dance of fertilization and early embryo development and later on fetal development taking place without a hitch. There's a lot. There's a quote, I have like an old Instagram post on it called "A healthy menstrual cycle sets the stage for a healthy pregnancy," because even beyond the egg quality argument, the earliest place that the egg implants is in the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus that you shed every single month during your menstrual cycle. So you really need a healthy endometrium to support a healthy pregnancy. Like, fertilization might take place just fine, but if there's not a safe, nourished place for that to implant, you can have problems. Plus, you need a healthy endometrium for a healthy placenta to develop. And so anyways, this goes back to you need a healthy cycle, you need healthy egg development, you need healthy sperm, you need good metabolic health, blood sugar balance, solid micronutrient reserves for all of these things to take place. Does pregnancy still happen when these things are not optimal? Yes, all the time. However, the potential consequences can be serious, higher rates of pregnancy loss, higher rates of pregnancy complication, many of which stem from problems with placental development, which is all, taking place in the first trimester, early into the second trimester. If that doesn't embed well into the uterine wall, you're going to have issues with nutrient transfer and blood flow to the baby, which can later show up as other pregnancy complications, right? So it does all go back. Although I focus Real Food for Pregnancy on the pregnancy part, I am working actually on another book tackling the preconception stuff as well, because it's so important to have that conversation. I never want people to feel like, oh no, I didn't do all the things to prepare for pregnancy and therefore I'm doomed and worst case scenario, because not everybody, many people like to catastrophize things. However, if we're really talking about what's optimal, starting preconception is ideal, really.
Yeah. And it was, I guess, Weston Price who, through his book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, made the observation that the tribes that he visited in the 1930s and all throughout the world, who are still practicing their traditional culture, had almost universally protocols or customs that involved, I guess, feeding women or encouraging the consumption of the most nutrient dense foods, such that all those things that you just mentioned, like metabolic health and quality of sperm and eggs for both partners, was optimized before they'd even, I guess, allow the lady to fall pregnant. So
yes,
I guess
they would often do it before marriage in some of these tribes, and they forbid conception prior to marriage, right? So yeah, they would have these special feedings of special diets for at least several months before, and it varies throughout the world, but you start looking at which things they put in there and compare that to the most nutrient dense foods on the planet, and they're always hitting the mark, right? It's like shellfish, organ meats, eggs, the yolks. Yeah.
Well, it almost, in certain situations, it sounded like the chief of the tribe is almost like a steward, or a steward of a botanic garden or some type of museum, in that he was thinking, not only the next generation, but he was thinking multiple generations ahead. And he
Mm-hmm.
knew that if you're going to ensure the health of the tribe, 5, 6, 7 generations ahead, then these kind of little details made a difference, which
Yeah.
is amazingly has amazing foresight, in a way that I guess simply we don't have today. But
Mm-hmm.
it's so fascinating to me that those were kind of independently evolved practices, no matter which tribe or which culture. They had this similar type of approach.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you read into that. And, Dr. Price's work was very influential on me throughout my career. Even I read his book before I even went to college to become a dietitian. So the whole time I was kind of looking at what I was learning in conventional school and comparing that to what I had read from Weston Price and all those related resources, and going, I haven't seen anything about phytic acid in here. I haven't seen anything about vitamin K2. I wonder if we could talk more about vitamin A. I wonder if we could talk more about this mineral, Yeah, his work is really important, and I think underappreciated in modern medicine. But it's a really fascinating read for anybody who wants to pick up the book.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And seeing as though so many or a large proportion of pregnancies are unplanned or don't go through a specific period that we've just mentioned of preparation, what advice would you give to women or couples who might have not got all their ducks in the row prior to, but are now, undertaking their
Yeah.
pregnancy journey?
Well, I would, take it one day at a time. Try not to get yourself into a place where you're just second guessing everything that you've have done or haven't done in the past, because the past is the past, right? Um, many, like at least half of pregnancies are unplanned, right? So many people find themselves in these shoes, and all you can do is take the next best step for where you're at. Um, I've had people reach out, I'm 37 weeks, is it too late to do anything positive? And of course it's not. Any place that you start is going to be beneficial. Um, the the challenge is that when starting something during pregnancy, pregnancy throws a whole range of symptoms at you, which may or may not be in your control. And I'm thinking specifically, usually in the first half of pregnancy, there's a much higher rate of, food aversions, nausea, vomiting, that can make it challenging to eat super well, even if you had every intention of eating this way. Which again kind of harkens back to the preconception thing. You can have a little more reassurance in the back of your mind that, I started this pregnancy with good nutrient stores. For this first trimester, this baby is really like pulling from the nutrient reserves in my endometrium, which actually they are until the placenta takes over and fueling them. So, our bodies do pull from our own maternal nutrient reserves if the diet is not that great. We all have some of those, even if our diet isn't that well, but you'll probably want to focus even more on nutrient repletion for the remainder of the pregnancy, and especially postpartum, if you know that you really haven't started from a super nutrient replete state ahead of time. So I just think, extra focus on nourishment now, without letting yourself go down like the stress worst case scenario highway of, oh no, if only I had known so and so, right? Like, even I learned a lot of things as I was writing Real Food for Pregnancy that I didn't know before having my first child. And I could be like, oh no, I should have focused more on choline. I should have taken this supplement. I should have done that. I don't even go there. It's like, wow, I know more now. I'm going to, implement this as best as I can now. But
Mm.
clearly, and I think that's one of the benefits of the real food part, is like, food contains so many different nutrients and in synergistic qualities that if you've been emphasizing, say, getting your zinc in, by default, meaning zinc from food. By default, you'll be consuming foods that are rich in vitamin B12 and iron and copper and vitamin B6 and selenium. Like a lot of these foods have a co-occurrence of many of these different nutrients. So even if you learn something new that you didn't know before, if you've been mostly, or at least from now forward, focusing on real food, you're probably going to be hitting more of the mark for those nutrients as well.
Yeah. And look, we can only do the best we can with what we've got at the time. So yeah, I'd echo Lily's message is that take it one day at a time and just control what you can control. There's no use in freaking out. So I think the thing that really stood out to me, and when I read your book, well, the first time I read it, was that your approach is very much focused on micronutrients and this concept that if we eat foods that provide us with micronutrients in abundance, then the types of foods and the macronutrients kind of fall into place around that.
Mm-hmm.
So I also like to think of, I guess, the theory or the concept of it as maybe walking through a supermarket. Like you could walk through two supermarkets. You can walk through one and the shelves, and not that I condone shopping in a supermarket. My listeners know I very much encourage people to buy straight from their farm. But for the purpose of the analogy, let's imagine that you're in a store and one of them has shelves stacked, 6 deep. They've got 6 products deep, and the other shelf has only perhaps 1 or 2 products on the shelves. Which shop would you prefer to walk through? And the analogy is building a baby. You want to be able to have, you want the process and the embryological development to be able to draw on as much of a product as it can at any given time, such that there's no limiting step. There's no point at which you don't have a nutrient that maybe prevents the optimal development of part of the baby or the placenta. So I guess that's this concept
Right.
of a surplus of nutrients that I really like. Well, that's how I've interpreted. How do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, that seems akin to kind of the bank account analogy or the battery pack analogy as well. Yeah, you want to be well resourced, and our bodies are also resilient in that sometimes when there's a shortage of one thing, we have a lot of metabolic pathways to try to, okay, we're low in folate or we're low in this, so we're going to use more of this. Like if you're low in folate, you might use more choline, more glycine, more of these other nutrients for some of the things that folate does. But it can't do all of the same things, and it might not do those things as efficiently, and you might waste some resources. Like if you're building a house and the best thing for building the house is screws, but you only have nails, it might not hold together quite as well. You might need a lot more nails to take the place of what a drywall screw could do with just a single one, right?
Yeah.
So whenever possible, the more resources you have to pull from, the better.
Yeah.
And one thing that I think may be helpful for listeners in sort of simplifying some of this information, as you talked about, like the micronutrients being a focus of mine. I personally feel that the data we have on micronutrients, while it's definitely imperfect, it is stronger than the data that we have on macronutrient levels. So if we just focus on our most nutrient dense foods and we know we're hitting the micronutrient requirements, then we'll just see what happens with the macronutrients. And the more data that has come out on that, I feel like that approach is even more justified, because if you eat in that way, what you end up prioritizing most is getting enough protein. Not that protein is the majority of your caloric intake, because that's actually impossible based on how our macronutrients are distributed in food. It's either going to be fat or carbohydrate. That's the majority factor. Protein, it's really hard to get over about a third of your calories, if that. But nonetheless, if you focus on protein-rich foods, which naturally have some fat in there as well, those are the ones that tend to be the most micronutrient dense. They have the most vitamins and minerals per calorie. And there was a recent analysis that came out looking at what are the most nutrient dense foods on the planet, like which ones fill these micronutrient voids. And I'm trying to remember the study. I've written about it on my Instagram, but I think they looked at something like 6 different key micronutrients. and you look at the foods that make up that list, it's basically all the foods I outline in the Foods to Emphasize chapter in Real Food for Pregnancy. Maybe they call out some additional specific ones that I don't have in there, like, goat would go along with like the, data I have on red meat, for example. And shellfish goes along with the data I have on seafood and whatnot. But it was essentially all animal foods and then leafy green vegetables. And it depends how much you extrapolate this out. Sometimes legumes make the list as well. And they arguably are fairly nutrient dense too. That's fine, right? But it was like, really, you end up looking at mostly your protein rich foods. And if you hit the mark for protein, which now we do have pretty strong data showing we need higher amounts of protein in pregnancy than we previously thought, you hit that macronutrient goal, you're probably also going to hit most of your micronutrients, under the assumption that your protein needs are being met by a diverse range of protein-rich foods, including animal-sourced protein. You would not get the same micronutrient density if it was all plant protein. But that sometimes is a really helpful thing for people to keep in mind, just to simplify things, like really just try to hit your protein targets, as much diversity as possible, and you have much more reassurance that you're meeting, or at least close to meeting, those micronutrient needs as well.
Yeah. And I mean, for the practical things about those type of foods, I mean, we're talking eggs, we're talking red meat, we're talking liver, we're talking things like oysters, seafood, fish, mussels. Anything else, Lily?
Dairy products were on there as well. There was one that was like small dried fish. In some countries, that's something that's used in a lot of different dishes, not as popular in the States, but something like, I feel like a sardine would kind of fit that role as well. It's not dried, right? When you dry something and take out all the moisture, it appears even more concentrated by weight, right? But something like a sardine that is canned with the bones, you're getting a much higher concentration of micronutrients than, say, a white fish that's had the skin and scales and bones removed, because there's actually quite a lot of nutrients in those parts.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I want to dive in now to, I guess, a specific couple of issues that crop up with regard to nutrition. Maybe we could start with this idea of folic acid, and it ties into what we're talking about early development of the baby. And basically, for the listener, one of the nutrients that we need to help the baby's early development, which is the closure of the neural tube happening between 3 and 4 weeks gestation, is folate. And we are recommended, or many women are recommended, to take folic acid specifically prior to and during conception to prevent problems with the development of the neural tube, which is known as neural tube defects or spina bifida. So this is it's a very interesting and can get quite complicated, this topic. But Lily, how do you think about I guess the conventional guidelines about recommending folic acid versus perhaps what the body truly needs to develop that neural tube optimally?
Yeah, so let's go back to some terms before I start going into this, because there's a lot of confusion on this topic. And I've actually created a lot of resources on this as well. Like, I have a very detailed blog article on my website on folate versus folic acid. I even have a 2-hour practitioner webinar on folate and methylation as it relates to fertility and pregnancy via the Women's Health Nutrition Academy. So if anyone wants to dive deeper than this conversation, the resources are there, both free and more in-depth professional kind of training. So folate is an umbrella term or a catch-all term. Whether that nutrient is naturally occurring or something that was created in a lab. There's many different types of folate in food. There's like 150 different types of naturally occurring folate, the vast majority of which found in food is in the methylfolate form. There is another form that is synthetically created in a lab called folic acid, and folic acid does not occur in nature. It does not occur naturally in our bodies. It does not occur naturally in any of our foods. It is purely a laboratory made form of folate. Of course, you can also synthesize folates for use in supplements that are structurally identical to what's found in food. So you can synthesize methylfolate and put it in a supplement, and it's fully readily utilizable by the body, even though it was made in a lab. So just like some clarification on those points, but folic acid in particular is not something we find in nature, whereas methylfolate and all these other forms of folate we do. There are differences in the way that our body metabolizes these nutrients. So because folic acid is not the form that's naturally occurring in nature or in our body, there are some extra steps our body has to go through to convert it into a form that's active, which the vast majority of the folate in our body is methylfolate, like 95 to 98% in our body, in cord blood, so what the infants are getting, in serum, in our red blood cells, like vast majority of it is methylfolate. So your body actually has to methylate that folic acid to make it usable. Folic acid got, I think, a lot of attention because it was the focus of a lot of the research. They found that there was probably a role for folates in the prevention of neural tube defects, and a number of studies were done where they used synthetic folic acid and found that it reduced the risk of certain neural tube defects. Folic acid is also very stable, and it's very inexpensive to produce, and you can very readily and cheaply fortify the food supply, which they do in many, many countries, the refined grain products especially, with folic acid in a large public health campaign to reduce the risk of neural tube defects. And in people who are severely folate deficient, this does overall appear to reduce the risk. However, it doesn't prevent all neural tube defects. About 30% of neural tube defects are what's called folic acid resistant, meaning it must have been something other than the folic acid that was preventing neural tube defects if they're still occurring in women who are folic acid supplemented prior to pregnancy and folic acid supplemented during early pregnancy at the time period when the neural tube is closing. And so there's actually a number of nutrients that are involved in the prevention of neural tube defects. We don't actually know all of the molecular mechanisms of what's going on. We don't even know why folic acid or folate works. We just know that women who are folate replete, whether that's from folic acid or from just eating enough folate in their diet or having other forms of folate coming in through supplementation, for example, women who are folate replete have a significantly lower rate of neural tube defects. And women who also have sufficient intake of a number of other nutrients that seem to play a role in the proper closure of the neural tube without any problem, such as vitamin B12, vitamin B6, choline, glycine, inositol. Those are the ones that I can remember off the top of my head. There might be a few others. Women who are replete in those nutrients have actually the lowest risk of neural tube defects. So it's not just the folate. I could go in a million directions from that, but if you have follow-up questions or want me to clarify anything, maybe that'll kind of direct me where you want to go on this.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Lily. That's such a comprehensive answer. And the point I want to emphasize is that it's just like in medicine, it's not just one drug. And in the idea of preventing these neural tube defects, it's just not one synthesized, purified nutrient. Like Lily said, it's a constellation of nutrients. And if we're also repleting B12, choline, B6, glycine, in addition to methylfolate, and again, all food derived, then that's the constellation of nutrients that are going to reduce or minimize the risk of having a defect like a neural tube defect as much as possible. And it's no surprise that there, as you said earlier in the podcast, there's synergy and there's synergistic action of these food-derived nutrients because that's how we evolved. There was no folic acid for the duration of human evolution. It was all methylfolate from liver, from egg yolks. and other types of foods. So I mean, this is a very kind of nuanced discussion, and there's another whole topic which regards to specific mutations in the metabolism of folate that can influence the
Right.
use of or which one you're suited for. But I guess suffice to say, methylfolate from food is the optimal form. Um, I wanted you to get your thoughts now on glycine, and a lot of people have no idea what glycine even is and why they should take glycine. But I guess from the point of view of supporting the placental development, supporting baby, and perhaps even preventing stretch marks, it seems to me that glycine is a very, very important nutrient throughout this whole period. So maybe give us a bit of your thoughts on glycine and what it is and how it helps.
Yeah, sure. So, glycine, interestingly, is a nutrient like folate involved in our methylation pathways. It doesn't get a whole lot of attention in conventional nutrition. It's our simplest amino acid, which also means it's very versatile. It can do a lot of different things in the body. It is a nutrient that, or an amino acid that we consider non-essential, or what's called conditionally essential, meaning during most phases of life, the argument goes, I'm not saying I agree with this, but the argument goes that during most phases of life, you don't require glycine in the diet. Your body can manufacture it from other amino acids. But in certain periods of high stress or high nutrient demands, and pregnancy falls into that category, it becomes conditionally essential, meaning you need to have a source of glycine in the diet to meet the metabolic demands for this amino acid. So the data on glycine is really fascinating. It seems that maybe some of its needs in higher amounts are related to its involvement in methylation. That's possible. There's a whole lot of methylation happening when you're like transcribing baby's DNA from
Yeah.
scratch, and a lot of different metabolic processes. It could have to do with the changes in connective tissue going on, because glycine is the amino acid found in greatest amounts in collagen. And there's a lot of collagen turnover in pregnancy, and also a lot of needs for collagen in the creation of baby's skin, hair, nails, bones, connective tissue, vasculature, and also all of the things that are happening in the maternal system as well. Like your body is expanding at rapid pace, so your connective tissue is changing, your bones are changing, your ligaments are changing, your skin is stretching. Oh, your uterus, it has 800% more collagen at term than it did pre-pregnancy. It's like
Mm.
lots of things are expanding that require collagen, which by default, glycine is one of the building blocks. So one of the places that you get glycine in food is in collagen-rich foods. Collagen is a protein that only is present in animal foods. Glycine is present in plant foods as well, but not nearly the concentration as it is in animal foods. So your collagen-rich cuts are going to be your richest sources. So things that have the connective tissue, skin, and bones of animal foods tend to be the greatest amounts. So bone broth, which by default you have bones and the connective tissue attaching it to meat. Slow cooked meat, so anything that's a really tough cut that requires slow cooking to be tender, like a pot roast or stews or pulled pork, something like that. If you eat chicken or poultry with the skin and then like save all the parts and make bone broth with it, pork cracklings, like fried pork skin or chicharrones would be another rich one. Anything using the skin. If you're pescatarian, even if you eat a whole fish, save all the bones, save the head, save all the parts, and make stock with it after the fact. Or you make fish and cook it in a way that the skin is delicious to eat as well. That would be probably your major source of glycine in the diet if you're in the pescatarian category. But all of these foods really would make up the majority of the intake. And of course, you'll notice that in modern times, many people are just going to the grocery store to get their meat, and it's all pre-packaged, pre-cut. The chicken is boneless, skinless chicken breast. The fish is just a fillet without the bones, without the skin. People are preferring, cuts like steak that are more tender to the ones that have more connective tissue. It's very different than the way that we consumed animal foods before. And that's, I think, only more relevant when, or only more, you only see it more when you're purchasing animal foods directly from a farm. Like if you do a cow share, pig share, you see what sorts of cuts you get. I mean, by default, the muscles are connected to the bones. And how are they connected to the bones? Like by connective tissue. A lot of what you get requires slow cooking to be edible and delicious and tender, right? So the way that we eat animal foods, like as a society as a whole, is really different than what we would have done ancestrally, where these glycine-rich, connective tissue-rich cuts would be, high priority in the diet.
Yeah. And it makes sense from the development of stretch marks if you're eating foods that are so bioavailable and rich in collagen, glycine, proline, all these essential amino acids that the tissue is going to become stretchy. It's going to be able to expand much, much, much more readily than if you're deficient in those building blocks. So a very, very, I guess, good reason why to include the foods that Lily just mentioned, and bone broth. And I think, for people who are vegetarian or, haven't yet got to the stage of eating red meat, I think if you can eat bone broth or fish broth, eat a gelatinous type broth, I mean, even that is, that's a very, very big win in terms of getting that essential nutrient in the diet. There's a nutrient that not many people talk about. It's a fat soluble vitamin called vitamin K2. And it's funny because it seems to be forgotten in mainstream medicine, mainstream nutrition almost completely. And for the listener, basically, vitamin K2 is found almost exclusively in animal foods and some fermented soy foods, but obviously the richest sources in liver, in organic grass-fed butter. And it's involved in the development of our bone structure. We're seeing, or I'm hearing anecdotally, that so many children or these days are having issues with swallowing, with obstructive sleep apnea, with even things like problems with latching. I had the thought that that the development of, and we know that the development of the jaw particularly is reliant on adequate K2 throughout childhood. Do you have any specific thoughts on K2, Lily? And perhaps is that influencing the development of babies' faces during gestation and such in early childhood?
Yeah. I mean, from a Dr. Price perspective, that would be a resounding yes. Although K2, which he called activator X, or we didn't know that it was vitamin K2 at the time. There was something in fatty animal foods that seemed to be supporting proper skeletal development and bone mineralization, which they later think is vitamin K2, actually. It's a symphony of nutrients, right? So you have all the fat-soluble vitamins in particular work in concert with one another, particularly vitamin A, D, and K, K2 specifically, I'd say, in supporting proper bone turnover and bone mineralization. When you have them in the right balance, which you do when you're eating, animal foods that have the fat in them still, ideally from animals raised in a way that they have sufficient levels of these nutrients, right? The closer an animal lives to how it ancestrally would have lived with the ancestral diet, they're, designed to live species appropriate diet, the greater the concentrations of these nutrients you're going to have. But these really direct where the minerals go. So K2, especially in concert with vitamin D, support proper bone mineralization. There's a whole lot of talk on the whole latching issue and tongue ties. Some people believe is related to potentially overexposure to synthetic folic acid. We only have one study looking at it so far. I do talk about that in the folate article that I mentioned earlier in this talk, but I think it's a whole range of nutrients that are playing a role here. Um, I have some like qualms with. There's a lot of they're great. I'm glad they're doing what they're doing, but forward thinking dentists and like myofunctional therapists giving all of these special exercises for people to do for better oral myofunctional everything, oral motor function and swallowing and keeping your tongue on the roof of your mouth and all these things. I'm sure like all helpful, all play a role in jaw development. But like, what if people aren't able to keep their tongue on the roof of their mouth or swallow in a certain way because their jaw is literally malformed from in utero? Like, yeah, some of these things I'm sure can help. But I know lots of adults with, excellent bone structure and no problem swallowing or sleeping or whatever, who arguably, when you look at them, probably have a tongue tie and they're fine. And on the flip side, you have people, with very poor, oral development and jaw development who are not tongue tied, where it's not a problem. Like, I really think that there's probably something we probably have to look further back and be targeting this from the preconception angle. I mean, certainly if there's issues going on, an oral myofunctional therapist is definitely somebody to have on your team to address it. But I think we're not addressing it early enough because something is going on where kids' jaws are not forming properly in utero. And I mean, this goes all the way back. If you look at like the Price Pottinger cat studies, or they had cats on, a raw milk diet and cats on like a cooked food diet, and their skeletons after, I think it was just one generation, were deformed. It's
Yeah.
like, is that not what we're seeing right now? I mean, it's certainly not normal that almost every child is going to require orthodontia at some point. Really, seriously, when you actually like, almost everybody needs orthodontia these days. And like, how would imagine if there was no orthodontists around, even in our generation? Can you imagine like the smiles that people would have, like all jacked up and like they can't even chew their food properly because there's not enough room for all their teeth and they're in front of the other, and it's like just a hot mess. I mean, thank God they're around now, but that's a bigger problem. Like,
Yeah.
something else is at work there, beyond, like just our young life, the way we're swallowing, not eating hard foods and all that stuff. I think it goes back to in utero development. I don't have any data on K2 specifically on jaw development, beyond sort of like the writings that we have from Weston Price, but I would surmise it has something to do with deficient levels of fat soluble vitamins and minerals would be my biggest guess.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lily. And that's exactly my hunch. I suspect that it is a reflection of a population level epidemic of fat soluble vitamin deficiency, particularly vitamin K2, but also vitamin A, vitamin D. And that's manifesting as malformed or inadequately formed faces. And I mean, a
Yeah.
funny story, a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, who I think has probably had the most properly developed facial structure as you would see, and functional, complete room for all his teeth to descend. He was basically fed from a kid on basically slices of wild harvested venison. His dad used to put a
Mm.
piece of cheese on them, and that's what he'd eat every night. And
Wow.
it's like something out of Weston Price. He's got a very, very well developed and functional face and jaw. So I guess as a message to the listener, then make sure you target foods from pregnancy and preconception that are rich in the fat soluble vitamins,
Yeah.
to I guess minimize the likelihood that's a problem. L-
Absolutely.
Lily, I'm mindful of time, because we've reached a hard stop. There's so many more topics that we could talk about. Do you have any, I guess, maybe final words or parting words for the listener about real food, or about pre-pregnancy conception, or about any of the topics we've discussed?
Sure. Well, I know it can be overwhelming, like the amount of information that's thrown at you and the shoulds or shouldn'ts. I just hope you can walk away with one tip from this episode to incorporate into your life, and you don't have to do everything all at once. For many of us, health is and finding a diet that works for us is a really long journey. I've been at this for a while. I started reading Weston Price's work when I was a teenager and was vegetarian at the time, right? So it's been quite a long journey of making change and adjusting things here and there. And then I think also, especially in more recent years, looking at things a little more holistically, where it's not just our nutrients that determine how well our body is going to function. A lot of this comes down to how well we care for our nervous system and manage stress in our life. And when we go to sleep, and if we see the sun early in the morning and we like ground our bare feet in the earth, like there's so many things that play into our health beyond food that I do sometimes worry that since my writing is all pretty much on nutrition, that people might kind of hyper focus and don't lose sight of the bigger picture as well. Like make little changes, like one at a time. The more you learn, the more you change. But you also have to have some some humility and be willing to adjust things if it doesn't feel right for your body, or something's just not working out with your current circumstances of where you live, right? I've lived all over the place, and there's some places where certain nutrient dense foods are readily available and affordable, and other times I live in places where they're not readily available and not affordable, and I simply can't get them, and I have to just make the best of the situation that I'm at. So none of us are perfect, but just take it one thing at a time.
Yeah, and that's fantastic advice. And I guess I think about just if you can adopt or emulate a pre-industrial, Homo sapiens behavior, and diet is, as you said, a critical but not the only facet, then you're going to be doing pretty
Yes.
well. So thank you so much, Lily, for your time, and you provided such a great amount of information and very, very helpful information for people. So I really appreciate that.
You bet. Thanks so much. It was a fun conversation.
Okay, what did you think of that? How good is Lily? She's an absolute wealth of information, and she explains things and difficult concepts so clearly. I think that if more practitioners, dietitians, midwives, obstetricians, general practitioners were familiar and had read Lily's work, then our pregnancy outcomes and our rates of fetal macrosomia and gestational diabetes would be a lot lower. So we covered a lot in this podcast, but there was also many topics that we didn't have time to cover. Particularly wanted to get her opinion on vitamin A in pregnancy and liver consumption in pregnancy, as well as breastfeeding, and this idea that the nutrient status of the mother, or the diet of the mother, is a determinant of the quality of the breast milk, and particularly the amount of nutrients that come out in the breast milk, which, as we know, should be an exclusive food for baby for at least 6 months. So if you all enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe on YouTube, and please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. And I will be getting back in touch with Lily in a couple months' time, and we'll be recording a follow-up. So thanks for listening, and thanks for your support.